Okay, welcome everyone to NMBF Coffee Chats. This is our place that we meet once or twice a week of the Christian Discussion Forum, where we discuss topics and issues that are relevant to our living as as a community, as members of the society, and also as people who live in this big world. And often our lives are connected, and what happens in another country context, especially a place like USA, will have its relevance and will have its bearing effect upon us as well. So we are so thankful to God as brothers and sisters in Christ. We can connect across, continents and borders because the love of God knows no borders. And so we are so thankful that God has provided Dr. Matthew D. Taylor for us to discuss this very important topic. Has American Christianity become a threat to global democracy? I'll just introduce our speaker, and I request you all to keep your mics on mute for your Q&A. Kindly hold on towards the end of the lecture. We'll have another separate section for the Q&A. Yeah. So Dr. Matthew D. Taylor is a senior Christian scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, Maryland, where he specializes in American Christianity, American Islam, Christian extremism, and religious politics. His new book, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy, which was released in 2024, tracks how a network of Christian leaders called the New Apostolic Reformation was a major instigating force for the January 6th insurrection and is currently reshaping the culture of the religious right in the US. He is also the author of The Scripture People, Salafi Muslims in Evangelical Christians America, that was released in 2023. Uh, Taylor holds a PhD in religious studies and Muslim Christian relations from Georgetown University and an MA in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. He's also currently a visiting scholar at the Center on Faith and Plus Justice at Georgetown University. So thank you so much, Dr. Matthew. We are so glad and so encouraged that you've joined us this session. And so over to you to lead us on this very interesting topic. Has American Christianity, has it become a threat to global democracy? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Abhijit, and thank you all of you for joining here. Let me share my screen. We'll be doing a slideshow, at least for the presentation time here. So we are speaking this evening for morning for me, evening for you, about some topics that are very complicated. And I'm going to try to be as clear as possible, but I'm sure there will be plenty of questions because these are not easy topics. So feel free to kind of write those questions down, and I will try to address as many of them as possible after the presentation. So can everyone see the screen okay? Yes? Okay, great. All right. Let me give us a quick outline for where I want to go in the next 45 minutes or so. First, I want to define some terms. So we have the title, Has American Christianity Become a Threat to Global Democracy? Well, what does that even mean? What do we mean by democracy? This is a word that is used a lot around the world today. People obviously mean very different things by it when they're using the word democracy, and I want to unpack a little bit about what do I mean when I say democracy? What is a threat to global democracy? What would entail a threat? What do we mean by American Christianity, and what do we mean by the term Christian nationalism that is in vogue these days to talk about these topics? So we'll work on some definitions. And then I want to speak a little bit about what's happening within American Christianity and why have many American Christians gravitated to Donald Trump and to supporting Donald Trump and to his movement. And then from there, I want to illustrate the impact of this American Christianity on global democracy using two different case studies: the assassination of Charlie Kirk and Christian Zionism as two kind of examples. And then in the conclusion, I want to think a little about what can we do about this? What can our response be? So we'll start with defining some of our terms. Okay. Now, when we talk about democracy. And this, again, this word is used all over the place. People mean quite a bit of different things. Everyone, or not almost everyone in the world, almost every nation in the world wants to claim that it is a democracy in some sense. What does that even mean? So here's my slightly adapted definition of democracy. This is pretty close to what a dictionary would probably tell you. So a democracy is a governing order in which the people, and here the root word is demos, right? The all eligible citizens exercises rule over society through elections and elected representatives. And sometimes in the United States, people will get hung up on, is it a republic or is it a democracy? In the world of political studies and political science, that really doesn't matter that much, right? Because in every democracy, you have elected representatives. And so, but the real question is, do the people drive the political process, or is it some other group? Now, in contemporary political science, there's a pretty basic distinction between what are called liberal democracies and illiberal democracies. And here we're using the term liberal not in the sense of being progressive, but in the sense of being about liberty and rights, and going back to the kind of questions of the Enlightenment. And so, when you talk about a liberal democracy in this sense, that's a society that has free and fair elections among multiple parties, right? There's a contest for power, has a separation of powers, what people in the United States will sometimes call checks and balances between these different branches of government, right? No single party, no single branch of government controls everything. It's where you have the rule of law, an independent justice system that is trying to be objective in meting out justice to all citizens, right? Protection for human rights and for freedom of speech. That's all what categorizes as liberal democracy. Now, if you look on this map that I have here, this comes from a think tank, and there's all kinds of studies on liberal democracies, but you can actually kind of quantify based on these different kind of objective markers how democratic, how liberal democratic a society is. Now, the other side of this is what scholars will call illiberal democracy, which you might rephrase as democracy in name only. And an illiberal democracy is a society where you see the opposite of many of these things in a liberal democracy. These can range from truly authoritarian and autocratic states with sham elections to societies that are trying to be democratic in certain ways, but are backsliding away from democracy more towards a one-party rule system, right? So there's a range of illiberal democracies. I mean, in Russia, there's a pretense that it's a democracy, right? Just don't try to run against Vladimir Putin, or you might end up getting poisoned with nuclear isotopes or thrown out of a window, right? So it might have the affect, it might have the pretense, the presentation of being a democracy, but it's not anywhere close to being a democracy, right? That's why it's Russia is this very pale yellow on the map, right? Because it is not a democracy in the liberal sense, right? So you can have formal democratic institutions in illiberal democracies, but very little separation of powers, very little opportunity for groups that are out of power to have any say in society. And what you see in these illiberal democracies is a curtailing of human rights and liberties in favor of state power. So that's the world as it exists circa 2024. Now, let me just make a few points about democracy before we move on. One is we have these two categories, right? Liberal and illiberal, but it's not everything fits neatly into those two categories. When we talk about democracy, it's not an on-off switch. It's not a yes or no question of whether a society is a democracy. It's more of a slider, a dimmer switch, right? You move back and forth between these two poles. It's not always kind of a binary state. And depending on how much a nation abides by its own democratic rules and norms, protects individual rights, has fair elections, we can decide, okay, well, where does it fall? And that's what that map is trying to do, right? What's the gradations within that? Now, within my own context, within the United States, we have historically gone through periods of stages of democratic growth, right? The post-Civil War amendments that allowed African Americans to participate as citizens in the United States system, right? That was a move towards liberal democracy. We've also backslid in different eras away from liberal democracy. There was a huge backlash after some of the post-Civil War era that led to Jim Crow and the entrenchment of race and race-based prejudice, especially in the South. So even in the United States, it's not the United States cannot kind of go around saying we've always been a liberal democracy, right? It's gone back and forth. These things swing in societies. And liberal democracies have evolved various ways of relating to religious traditions. And this is the question in political science sometimes talked about as establishment. Is there an established religion, a single official religion? And some forms of religious nationalism that we'll talk about can be quite compatible with liberal democracy, and others are very much not. So just to give an example, you have an image here of the coronation of King Charles of England. And the coronation, as Indians, you may have a certain sense of emotional attachment to Britain for good or for ill, right? But in the coronation of the new king, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the one placing the crown on the head of the king. And while people are reciting prayers and holding a religious service and singing hymns, right? This is textbook Christian nationalism. Now, it's also not necessarily a threat to the democracy in the UK because the Church of England has a fairly symbolic relationship with and kind of an official relationship with the state. From what I understand, less than 5% of people in the UK are attending an Anglican church on any given Sunday, right? So it's not like this. Yes, there is this kind of symbolic vestigial ceremony going on, but it's not like that is a sign of how Christians are taking over the UK or something like that. So I would still call the United Kingdom a liberal democracy, even as it has these kind of vestiges of religious nationalism still there. Now, when we talk about religious nationalist movements that threaten democracy, these are those that would start by privileging one religious community's citizenship over others. These are the real citizens of our society, the privileged citizens, the primary citizens, right? Ones that use demonization and threats of violence to bring an authoritarian leader to power, and ones that will sacralize, as in make holy or baptize an authoritarian agenda using theology, using religious discourse to make it seem like God's or the God's agenda, right? Those are all ways that religious movements can begin to threaten and challenge democracy. So let's think about the world as we see it right now. And who are some of the major actors around the world in these illiberal leaders who are dismantling democracies? And where are we seeing states that are in this transition right now? Well, obviously, my own context of the United States is maybe the most prominent example of this, as we see Donald Trump taking power and the Make America Great Again movement taking over our Republican Party and really remaking our government in real time around these more illiberal tendencies. Of course, Vladimir Putin, very prominent. I mean, as I said, Russia pretends to be a democracy. It is not a democracy in any true sense, but it is also actively participating in dismantling other democracies, right? Russian propaganda is being used around the world by far-right actors in order to attack their own democracies. Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey is remaking the secular Turkish state into a more Islamic nationalist state, built around a certain kind of mythology of the Ottoman Empire. Viktor Orban in Hungary, very prominent. It's not Hungary's not a huge state, but it punches way above its weight in international relations because of its embrace of Christian nationalism. And many American far-right Christians look to Hungary as a model of what they want to turn the United States into. Bibi Netanyahu in Israel has been actively dismantling the structures of Israeli democracy. Some of this was going on before October 7th. Plenty of it has been going on since October 7th, and he leads a far-right coalition that is trying to entrench its own power in certain ways. Some more that may not always be on people's radars because they tend to be kind of smaller countries, but Min Aung Hlaing from Myanmar has been participating in a kind of Buddhist nationalist, but also a military dictatorship that has, I mean, Myanmar has been through a great deal of trauma and turmoil in the last 20 years, but since 2021, when there was this kind of uprising and then the military takeover, military coup, Min Aung Hlaing has been kind of pushing a militaristic vision of Buddhist nationalism. Or Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who has been featured in the news more in part because of U.S. sending prisoners to El Salvador. But he is trying to kind of make this play to be a new kind of far right thought leader, or Javier Milei in Argentina, right? All of these actors that when these guys get together, they seem to get along pretty well, right? These world leaders seem to see eye to eye with each other and resonate with each other. Now, we can get hung up on the leaders, though, right? These guys have different ideologies, different systems, but these are some of the leaders who have deep affinities with each other. But on the ground level, we are also witnessing a building of a global infrastructure of illiberalism, right? Even as when Trump goes and meets with Putin, they see eye to eye. Well, their followers also see eye to eye and are networking and connecting. So right now, just as we see far-right political leaders networking amongst themselves, we also see their movements and their followers building new networks together. New activist networks, new think tanks, new philanthropy efforts, new messaging and communications and media efforts, new memes that get carried across these different national contexts. So we sometimes talk about religious nationalism and think about it as kind of conscribed within the borders of a nation, right? Because that's what nationalism is. Nationalism is obsessed with borders and boundaries and who belongs and who doesn't belong. And sometimes those boundaries are literal, right? And at the US border today, there's this active effort to resist migration. But sometimes those boundaries are symbolic. Who are the real Americans? Who belongs here, right? And that's where you start to see white supremacy and Christian supremacy emerge. Now, we also have to talk about Christian nationalism to understand some of what we're talking about. And really, when we talk about Christian nationalism, I think it can be helpful to kind of default to more of a biological sciences way of talking about this, to think about the family of religious nationalisms and religious nationalist movements. There's all kinds of different forms of religious nationalism. Then the genus of Christian nationalisms, there's multiple forms of Christian nationalism. And then when you get down to the species level, that's where you can maybe talk about American Christian nationalism. I would argue there's multiple forms of Christian nationalism, even in the United States, multiple theologies, multiple strands of theology that contribute to Christian nationalism. And globally right now, we are experiencing a tidal and seismic shift in the rise of an emergence of religious nationalist movements, often aligned with these far-right politics. Right? So we have Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar. We have religious Zionism in Israel, which is not all Zionists are religious Zionists, but some are. And religious Zionism is kind of this ascendant force within Israeli politics. Or Christian nationalism in Brazil, or in Hungary, or in Russia, right? You can go through all kinds of different forms of religious nationalism. There are differences, but these all kind of correlate and map onto each other in different ways. And so in the US, when somebody says, and this is how the surveys usually ask it, is the United States a Christian nation? About 45% of the US population says yes to that question in surveys. Should America be a Christian nation? Now, they can mean different things by that statement, though. Some people mean that Christians are the majority, and so it's de facto a Christian nation. That has always been true. Christians have always been the majority in the United States. It's decreasingly true. About 35 years ago, 90% of Americans identified as Christian. Today, it's down to around 62, 63%. Right? So we've had this rapid shift of secularization, losing about 1% of self-identifying Christians a year for the last 30 years. That has led to this shift in our population. They might also mean that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation on Christian principles. And that's usually not a very historically informed way of talking about the American founding, but many people buy into that idea. But the most dangerous version of this is when people start saying to be a Christian nation means that Christians should be privileged over other people, and Christians should have a premier form of citizenship, or that Christianity should be privileged over other forms of religion and ideology in our society. And that's where you start to get into this anti-democratic Christian supremacist mindset. So when we talk about Christian nationalism, again, we're not. It's a dimmer switch. It's not a binary, right? You aren't yes or no. It's more kind of different forms of Christian nationalism. On one side of the spectrum, we have in the U.S. a more kind of passive, soft form of Christian nationalism. I think of this as very much associated with this popular song in America, "God Bless America." Right? Christians will sing "God Bless America." A lot of Americans will sing "God Bless America," right? That's a form of religious nationalism, right? You're asking for a special favor from God on your nation. It doesn't keep me up at night. I grew up going to an evangelical church where in the front of the church we had the Christian flag and the American flag in the front of the church. That's Christian nationalism. Now, is that a grave threat to American democracy? No. That has always been a part of our politics. But it's there. It's present. Now, as you move along the spectrum, you start getting into these more hardline forms of Christian nationalism, and this is where I use this term Christian supremacy, because it's something more aggressive than just a kind of identification of the nation with this religious tradition. And this is where you have a Christian flag next to an American flag on the front lines of January 6th, right? This is where we start getting into this threat to democracy. Now, and this is an important point, the more theology you introduce into your Christian nationalism, the more dangerous and hardline it becomes. For a lot of the people who are just the guy, God bless America, I like the idea of being in a Christian nation, but it's not an agenda for them. It's sentiment, right? It's an emotional thing for them. The more theological and programmatic it becomes, the more hardline it becomes and the more dangerous it becomes. And so when we talk about radicalization within the Christian community, both in the US and around the world, we're talking about people moving along this spectrum, moving from these more kind of sentimental, I like the idea I live in a Christian nation, I have no idea what that means, into these very kind of aggressive visions of Christians having power over society. And some of the things that are radicalizing Christians in the US right now, and I would argue are radicalizing Christians around the world, are things like conspiracy theories. Oh, sorry, I went too far. Things like conspiracy theories, things like these biblical reinterpretations that we are seeing very rapidly, and I'll highlight some of these, the ways that new applications, new interpretations of the Bible are driving some of these dynamics. We are also seeing a lot of modern prophecies, a lot of discourse and talk about modern prophets, and even intellectual forms of this, philosophy and theology. So we're going to move into the next section here and thinking about what is happening within the US right now. What are we seeing? Why did Christians attach themselves to Donald Trump in the way that they have? And so what we're seeing right now, as Trump has swept back into power, and is used, I have observed Donald Trump over the last 10 years of his political career very closely. There's a new way of speaking and using Christianity that has taken hold in the Trump camp. It was always there. It was always a thread in there, but it has become a much more prominent and important part of their way of speaking, especially since last summer, the summer of 2024, when Trump had this assassination attempt on him. So today, Donald Trump, who has not been punished for attempting to overthrow the US government on January 6, 2021, has swept back into power in a second term, and he's bringing with him this cohort of these fringy far-right outsiders, people like many of the members of his cabinet, and he's claiming a divine mandate. He's claiming that God has put him back in office, and that even the assassination attempt that happened last summer was a sign of God's favor on Donald Trump. Now, some of the symbols of this, some of the ways we see this showing up during the prosecutions of Donald Trump when he was on trial in between his two terms, he reposted this AI-generated image of himself sitting at the defense table in the courtroom next to Jesus. Right? And this idea of Trump is with Jesus. Jesus and Trump are side by side. They are kin, right? Or you have these images, and they're constantly hitting our media of religious leaders praying over Donald Trump, often in the Oval Office. This one's from this past February. There are dozens of these images, maybe hundreds of these images now. Photographs of religious leaders praying over and laying hands on Donald Trump. Some of them are almost kind of bowing to him, right? Like their orientation is all towards him, right? Or just about a week ago, Donald Trump sent out this fundraising email. Who knows who wrote the fundraising email? But listen to the language here, right? Because this is different from what Trump was doing in his first term. He says, "Since the day I returned to the White House, I have felt the mighty hand of God guiding this movement. His word reminds us, if God is for us, who can be against us?" And then suddenly there's a big "Stand with Trump" button that you can click on, right? So God is for us. Stand with Trump. And he goes on, and remember this, when you give to my campaign, you are not just contributing to a political cause, you are sowing a seed of faith into the future of our nation. The Bible tells us faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains, and together our faith will move America back to God, back to truth, back to greatness. Make America great again, and that's a donate button to his political campaign, right? So this conflation of the cause of God, the cause of Trump, the Make America Great Again movement, that and really this is a televangelism appeal, right? Sow a seed of faith, right? And he's learning from the televangelists who are his advisors how to make more money and make these fundraising appeals. So Donald Trump, I would argue, would not be the president of the United States today without these Christian supremacist theologies that have sanctified him and made him into this quasi-messianic figure in many Christian circles. And so I want in the rest of our time to try to kind of get underneath where are these theologies coming from, and what is driving them, and what can we do about that. So before we get though there, I want to think a little bit differently about how we sort American and maybe global Christianity. So this is coming out of my book, and I'll try to go through it fairly quickly. But I think it's important how we categorize and sort Christians, because often you'll hear this term evangelical Christians. Means a lot of things in different cultures. Even in the US, people use this term evangelical as though it was a single kind of identity or group. It's not. It's actually a wide range of groups. So in this model, there are two guiding questions that determine how you kind of align things. And they're fairly objective. Is a group denominational? As in, do they belong to a denomination? Are they part of a broader structure with history and governance that is attached beyond the level of the individual church? And are they charismatic? And when we say charismatic here, we're talking about Pentecostalism and the charismatic movements, right? Not in the sense of like, oh, this person has a very attractive personality. We're using the Christian sense, right? Do they embrace this spirituality that is centered on the life of the early church, that is attached, trying to tap into the supernaturalism of the early church, belief in miracles, speaking in tongues, modern prophecy, these sorts of things. So if you take those two questions and map them onto a grid of yes or no, you get four quadrants. And the first quadrant will be yes to denominational and no to charismatic. And this is where most Catholics would land, most mainline Protestants, most historically black Protestants, and what I would call classical evangelicals in the American sense, right? These are the kind of old school evangelicals going back into the 18th or 19th centuries. And this is how many American Christians think. This is where Christianity is centered, is in this first quadrant, non-charismatic and denominational. Now, in the second quadrant, you would have non-denominational and non-charismatic. And in the U.S., this is a space that's often dominated by Calvinists in the Reformed tradition. And this is kind of this quest, right, to find an authentic Christianity that is not tied to these denominations or these kind of older structures, right? And these are kind of the independent evangelicals in our context. Now, quadrant 3 is really the realm of Pentecostalism, at least in the way that we talk about it in the U.S., right? So in the U.S., Pentecostalism is a denominational movement. And to be a Pentecostal is to belong to one of the Pentecostal denominations, often going back to the beginning of the 20th century with the rise of Pentecostalism in the U.S. and globally. You also have a number of charismatic Catholics who belong within this space, right? Charismatic Catholicism is spreading very rapidly around the world. It's a real force within global Catholicism, or even occasionally charismatic mainline Protestants. But I really want to focus on this fourth quadrant. And that's where you have the intersection of non-denominational governance and charismatic spirituality. And these are where we talk about the independent charismatics. So these are folks who are not tied to these bigger structures, but who are very much embracing this kind of charismatic spirituality. And these folks, I mean, there are evangelicals in every one of these quadrants in the U.S., right? But these folks will call themselves evangelical, but they mean something very particular. They have a subculture within evangelicalism. So as I said, there are evangelical Christians who fit into every one of these quadrants, right? But they're very different kinds of evangelicals, right? The denominational non-charismatic evangelicals might share some theology with the independent charismatics, but culturally they're very, very different. And the more governance via denominations or other supervisory bodies means more tradition and more oversight, maybe more wisdom, but also more bureaucracy and slower growth. And so people are being attracted to these more non-denominational spaces. And people's disillusionment with institutions, because many Christian institutions and many cultural institutions have let people down to a great degree, leads them to be attracted to these more non-denominational and unregulated churches because there's this sense of authenticity there, this sense of detachment from these bigger, maybe disillusioning institutions. And when we think about charismatic spirituality, right, nothing wrong with being charismatic, but charismatic spirituality can be an accelerant for more passion, more personal involvement, more personal connection to your faith. It can also be an accelerant for political extremism. And I want to talk about that. So when we talk about the independent charismatics, so just kind of how do you identify what's an independent charismatic or whether you're connected to an independent charismatic church? Well, these are some of the markers, right? This is the fastest growing form of Christianity, both in the United States and globally. The chart here at the bottom of your screen comes from the Center for the Study of World Christianity. They estimate this is global numbers. They estimate in 1970 that there were about 44 million independent charismatics in the world globally. By 2020, their estimate was up to 312 million. So you're talking about a segment of global Christianity that's roughly doubling in size every 20 years right now, right? Very rapid growth. It's also a segment of Christianity in the US and globally that's very ethnically diverse and globally connected. These are not just kind of, I live in America and that's my identity. These are folks who are tied in to global and transnational networks, often through family and through connections, through immigration experiences. There's widespread belief in modern prophecy, not just biblical prophecy, that there are prophets in the Bible or prophecies in the Bible that have not yet been fulfilled. These folks believe in modern prophecy, that there are prophets who walk among us, who can speak the words of God. They believe in ecstatic spiritual practices, strong emphasis on spiritual warfare, on angels and demons, and battling back against the forces of Satan. And again, not tied into these denominational and accountability structures, but they do have this highly networked global leadership and celebrity class. There are in this, people sometimes think of non-denominational as being without structure. There's a great deal of structure in non-denominational spaces. It's just more relational structures among the leaders. They get to know each other. They hang out in green rooms at conferences. They meet together. They have leadership gatherings. There's a lot of networking that goes on in that space. And so I sometimes refer to this as the Silicon Valley of the American church. Very innovative, very entrepreneurial, very exciting, lots of interesting personalities, not a lot of regulation, not a lot of wisdom, right? Not and people are willing to drive hard and break things, right? And they're willing to try new things, but that sometimes can have a destructive edge. Now, back in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a very important thought leader in the United States in this independent charismatic space, a guy named C. Peter Wagner. Peter Wagner was a seminary professor at Fuller Seminary, where I actually attended. And he was a professor of church growth, focused on how do you help churches to grow. And he was really involved in some of this spiritual warfare stuff, was very fascinating, was kind of trying to develop new models of spiritual warfare in the 1980s and 1990s. Very focused on battling against hierarchies of demons, what he called territorial spirits. And he came to believe in some of these kind of charismatic ideas about modern apostles, modern prophets, what sometimes goes under the rubric of fivefold ministry, if you've heard of that. And this belief that these modern apostles and prophets would inaugurate and establish Christian dominion over societies, inaugurate a global revival that would bring about Christian dominion over societies. And so Wagner started to create a set of leadership networks that he called the New Apostolic Reformation. And this was in the 1990s and early 2000s. And hundreds of leaders joined these networks, and almost everyone joining the networks identified themselves as either an apostle or a prophet. And these are very influential leaders, both in the US and globally. These are some of the most entrepreneurial and engaged pastors in the charismatic world who were joining up with Wagner's network, joining up with this New Apostolic Reformation program. But again, these are not institutions that you can easily look up and figure out who belongs to them. They're kind of relational networks built around Wagner and his people. And so these leaders in Wagner's network became very influential in the global conversation among independent charismatics. These became some of the leading celebrities, the leading lights in that world. Now, how does their theology work? I'm going to sketch it very, very quickly here. So, first, they believe that there are modern apostles and prophets who are being commissioned and empowered by the Holy Spirit to bring about a global end times revival. Right? So they're very fixated on this idea of revival and eschatology with the end of the world. And so they believe that apostles and prophets are sent by Jesus to disciple nations. That's how they're interpreting the Great Commission. And I'll just note, it's a very different interpretation of the Great Commission than most Christians throughout history. Most Christians read the Great Commission, Matthew 28, as go out into the world and disciple the people of the nations. But they say, no, no, no. Jesus said disciple the nations. And so apostles must disciple nations, right? So the nation becomes the subject, the object of Christian mission. Pretty early on in the NAR, around the turn of the millennium, a leader named Lance Wallnau came in with this prophecy called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And the Seven Mountain Mandate is this idea that you can divide society up into 7 spheres of influence: religion, family, education, media, government, business, arts and entertainment. And each of those they conceive of as a mountain. And then they believe that spiritual warfare means that Christians need to take over each of those 7 mountains in every society and then let Christian influence flow down, right? Because either Satan controls the mountains or God and the Christians control the mountains. And so Christians need to take over the mountains. And how do they do that? How do they go about taking over the mountains? Well, they need to do spiritual warfare. They need to go and battle against the demons that hold control over the 7 mountains now. And so the apostles and prophets become generals of spiritual warfare who can lead the church in campaigns of spiritual warfare against these hierarchies of demons so that Christians can take dominion over the earth. Now, this is a pretty extreme way of thinking about Christian theology. Very, very popular in these independent charismatic spaces, though, because again, they're claiming these are prophecies. These are revelations from God. So let me highlight 3 important coincidences that lead to Christians supporting Donald Trump. So one is this guy from Peter Wagner's inner circle, a guy named Dutch Sheets, around the year 2013, believes that he receives a vision of a flag. He's given a flag. It's a flag from American history. It goes back to the American Revolution. It has a green pine tree at the center. It says an appeal to heaven at the top. And Sheets believes that this is a revelation, a prophecy of a spiritual revolution that will take place in America. And he goes and begins to campaign around this appeal to heaven flag and spread this idea, this meme of an appeal to heaven flag as a symbol for a Christian revolution in America. And he really rolls that out in the summer of 2015. Is when this whole campaign launches. And it just so happens that's the same time that Donald Trump is becoming a candidate for office. And so Donald Trump hits the scene in the summer of 2015 and declares his candidacy. And he turns to his closest religious advisor, a woman named Paula White Cain. And Paula White Cain is an independent charismatic televangelist, a megachurch pastor, an apostle, and a prosperity gospel preacher. And she's been Donald Trump's closest religious advisor since around 2001, 2002. And he turns to her and he says, I want you to be my bridge builder to the evangelicals. I want you to do the work of bringing in the evangelicals. Now, Paula White doesn't know conventional evangelicals. Those aren't her circles. She knows independent charismatic evangelicals. Those are the people that she travels with, right? And so those are the people she starts to invite in to meet with Trump. The first religious leaders to meet with Donald Trump are overwhelmingly these independent charismatic celebrities, televangelists, apostles, prophets, worship leaders, revivalists, these kind of people that would have been considered kind of fringe in American Christianity before. And one of the guys in those meetings is Lance Wallnau, the 7 Mountains guy, this key leader in the NAR. And here's the third coincidence. Lance Wallnau claims when he meets Donald Trump that he receives a new prophecy. And this is a prophecy about Donald Trump. And the prophecy is that Donald Trump is a modern day Cyrus. And if you know your Hebrew Bible history, Cyrus is the emperor of the Persian Empire who sends the Jews back from exile to rebuild Jerusalem. And in Isaiah 45, God refers to Cyrus using messianic language, right? He calls him an anointed one, which is where we get the term Mashiach, Messiah, right? Now, he's not the Messiah, he's a Messiah, he's a savior for Israel. And so Wall now is saying Donald Trump can be a Cyrus to American Christians. He's not a good Christian, he might not even be a Christian, but he can be an anointed figure by God to enact God's agenda. Now, I'm going to skip over a lot of history here because it's very dense. But if you want, you can go read my book or go listen to my podcast. The book is called The Violent Taken by Force. The podcast is called Charismatic Revival Fury. And I tell the story of how you go from that moment in 2015 with these leaders meeting with Trump all the way to January 6th. Because Lance Wallnau and the NAR were the key theological architects of the attempt to overturn our democracy after the 2020 election. Now, we're going to skip over all that because I want to get into our last two examples here. So we've got these networks around the globe, spreading far-right networks. We've got this kind of Trump instance in the US, this kind of MAGA outpost, this Make America Great Again outpost of this kind of these global networks. I want to illustrate using Charlie Kirk and Christian Zionism, the impact of this American Christian supremacy conversation on the global conversation within Christianity and the far right. So when Charlie Kirk was assassinated on September 10th, that sent a shockwave through the global far right networks. All of these networks, all this infrastructure that had been built up over some decades with these leaders and these think tanks and all, the Charlie Kirk thing just shot through all of those networks, and so you had. Right, so he's assassinated in the United States, and he was very close to Donald Trump. Was a key unifying figure in like organizing the far right and especially Christians on the far right. And so just a few days later, you have this big rally, this far right rally in London, in Britain, and people are holding signs about Charlie Kirk, right? And at this, it wasn't even a particularly Christian rally. I mean, there were a lot of Christians involved, but they're holding up these signs about Charlie Kirk as a symbol of the far right. Or Putin and his confessor, this high up priest in the Russian Orthodox Church, declaring that Charlie Kirk was a martyr. What's the stake of the Russian Orthodox Church in Charlie Kirk, right? He was not Russian, he was not Orthodox, right? But they're holding him up as a symbol. They're attaching things to him, right? Or in Budapest, in Hungary, right? In Viktor Orban's backyard, some of Orban's allies set up a memorial to Charlie Kirk at the U.S. Embassy in Budapest, right? And they're holding a rally there. And one of the speakers at this rally said about the assassination that it was a strike against civilization, against Judeo-Christian culture, and against the sanctity of life, right? So they're tying this very particular American political violence incident into these bigger narratives about civilization and Judeo-Christian and life and family and all these other kind of words that have resonance with their audiences, right? Or in Tel Aviv, right? Charlie Kirk is a Christian. And yet in Tel Aviv, the government of Israel and some of the leaders in Israel start doing all these memorials to Charlie Kirk, including this one where they had a big sign on the side of a building. This went up 3 days after the assassination with Kirk hugging Donald Trump and the message to rest in peace. But notice right behind Charlie Kirk, there's an Israeli flag, right? So trying to loop him into their symbols, to their kind of causes. Or in South Korea, you had Christians chanting, "We are Charlie Kirk." Now, on some level, okay, great. Christians are identifying with another Christian. How's that news? Well, some of the other signs that they were carrying weren't just "We are Charlie Kirk." They were signs that saying, "Why are you left wing? Are you a feminist? Are you a communist? Are you an ethnic Chinese? Are you a sexual minority? Are you a drug addict?" Right? They're building out to other narratives, other political causes from this incident. Maybe my favorite of these incidents actually happened in Lima, Peru, where there's this ambitious far-right local politician who it's a complicated story, the legal battle that he's having internationally. He's trying to curry favor with the Trump administration because they can potentially save him millions of dollars if they make a decision in his favor. And so this far-right local mayor in Lima, Peru, organizes this big rally on behalf of Charlie Kirk. But there are reporters there that are interviewing the 1,000 or so people who show up at this rally and saying, "Well, what did Charlie Kirk mean to you?" And the people at the rally are like, "Who is Charlie Kirk?" Right? They weren't there because they cared about Charlie Kirk. They were there because The mayor offered them buses and said, "Here's a big festival. Come to this big festival." Right? They had no idea who Charlie Kirk was, but they were incentivized to be there because the mayor was using this to further his own international political ends. All right, so there's this case study in Charlie Kirk of how one incident in the U.S. can then have these ramifications around the world. Okay, really quickly before we wrap, let's talk a little bit about Christian Zionism. So Christian Zionism just to do the very, very briefest of histories, right? Of course, Christianity emerges out of Judaism, right? Jesus was Jewish, the early church was Jewish, but Christian-Jewish relations have been anything but harmonious. And I think we as Christians have a lot to answer for historically in how Jews have been treated by Christians, right? Christians have persecuted Jews, forced conversions, trafficked conspiracy theories. Most of anti-Semitism, most of modern anti-Semitism takes its root in Christian history. And since the emergence of Protestantism, there's been this renewed interest in eschatology, right? The theology of the end of the world. And Jews in Israel factor heavily in many of the apocalyptic passages in the Bible, right? So Christian Zionism is a form of what we could call philo-Semitism. I'll define that in just a sec, right? So philo-Semitism is the opposite of anti-Semitism, or maybe not the opposite, right? So philo-Semitism is the idea that Jews are different than the rest of humanity, and therefore we love them, right? Philo, we love them. Anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews are different than the rest of humanity, and therefore we hate them and fear them. Now, in many ways, those are just two sides of the same coin. Because it starts out with this separating Jews from the rest of humanity, this dehumanizing movement. And then it becomes a question of, well, how do you feel about that? Right? What's your mood? If you're positive about Jews, then you're a philo-Semite. If you're negative about Jews, you're anti-Semite. You've already dehumanized Jews from the beginning of the conversation, right? And so people can move between philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. They're actually pretty close to each other. And many Christians have deep and emotional and theological ties to the state of Israel because of passages in the Bible. But it's about their conception, their Christian conception of Judaism. It's not that they have Jewish friends, it's that they imagine Jews in a certain way. And it's not always about the interests of Jewish people. It's still a Christian agenda. And so the people who get left out of Christian Zionism are diaspora Jews, Jews who don't live in Israel. Because Christian Zionism is about Israel. It's not really about Jews. And so let me illustrate this by talking about one of these New Apostolic Reformation apostles. He's a guy named Mario Bromnick. Mario Bromnick is a pastor in Florida, but he's also a Trump evangelical advisor. He's one of Trump's religious advisors. And he's a New Apostolic Reformation apostle in these networks of the NAR. And he's a Christian Zionist. He's a very ardent Christian Zionist. He leads an organization called Latino Coalition for Israel. And so here he is praying over Donald Trump in Florida after his indictment in the state of Florida. Here he is with the newly indicted far-right former president of Brazil, actually newly convicted former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, who's a Catholic. Except here Bolsonaro is wearing a tallit, a Jewish prayer shawl. Right, so there's Bromnick making his networks, making his way. Here he is hanging out with the Hungarian ambassador and doing a big event with the Hungarian ambassador. Isn't that interesting? Here he is in a meeting at the White House with Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump, and then going on Christian television and talking about that meeting. Right, so he's this very, very networked person within these global networks, and he's a Christian Zionist, a very ardent Christian Zionist, one of the most influential Christian Zionists in the United States. So part of the point that I'm trying to make is that the NAR lives at this intersection of Christian Zionism, right? Christian support for the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, for theological reasons. Christian supremacy, this idea that Christians get to rule over societies and are entitled to rule over societies and dominate cultures. And then this far-right activism, right? This dismantling of democracy in order to install authoritarian governments. Well, the NAR and Mario Bromnick, they live right at the intersection of those things. Not all Christian Zionists are Christian supremacists, but those who are tend to kind of align around some of these NAR themes. Not all far-right activists are even Christian, but those who are tend to align with these other causes. So when we compare, I'm going to actually skip over that and just make one last point about some of what's happening in the U.S. right now. all of this is getting a lot worse right now because what started out as this kind of merger of convenience, a marriage of convenience between the New Apostolic Reformation and Donald Trump, is now accelerating. And so you had the prophecies are getting more aggressive. So this is an incident that happened just before our election last year, almost a year ago. Donald Trump gathered with his faith advisors and Paula White Cain for an event in Georgia. And this very, very prominent Messianic rabbi, a guy named Jonathan Cahn. Messianic Judaism, right, claims to be both Jewish and Christian. So Jonathan Cahn he's a Christian who also identifies as Jewish, as a rabbi. And Jonathan Cahn got up and issued this prophecy publicly over Donald Trump. There's videos of this online where he says, Mr. President, he's saying this to Trump, who's sitting in the front row with all of Trump's religious advisors around him. He says, Mr. President, I speak of the mystery of your life. God called you to walk according to the template of Jehu. Jehu came to the capital city with an agenda to drain the swamp. Jehu was born to make his nation great again by turning it back to God. Now, if that Bible reference doesn't bring up anything for you, it's probably because it's a very obscure Bible reference. This is 2 Kings 9 and 10, right? The story of Jehu is a very scary story. This is the story of Ahab and Jezebel, right? Ahab and Jezebel are the wicked king and queen. Well, Ahab dies, Jezebel's still alive. Jehu's the one who's appointed king after Ahab. And so Jehu goes and executes Jezebel. Not just executes, but annihilates her, has her servants throw her out of a high tower. When her body hits the ground, he tramples her with his horse. And then he goes and eats a meal while wild dogs come and eat her body. And the message of the passage is Jezebel is so profane, so evil, that she has to be reduced to dog feces and all memory of her eradicated. That's the imagery that they were using. And they were very actively saying Kamala Harris is a Jezebel, right? So to call Donald Trump a Jehu is to say he is entitled to violence against his enemies because he's following a biblical script. This is the destiny that God has for him, to be violent against his enemies. And then Jehu goes on and slaughters all the family of Ahab and Jezebel and piles their children's heads up at the city gates. It's a devastating story. One of the most violent stories in the Bible. This is the imagery they have shifted to talk about Trump. So right now, this Make America Great Again spirituality is built around this narrative of Donald Trump as Messiah, as the savior who can fix everything in America and in the world. And it's being supported by all these different forms of NAR and independent charismatic theology, right? The prophecies about Donald Trump and saying the prophecies, especially around the elections, have been driving a lot of this violence, right? Spiritual warfare as a form of politics, these appeal to heaven flags that we see all over the place in our different political rallies, these far right rallies, experiential forms of worship that are very focused on kind of giving people these revival experiences, and the Seven Mountains. All of this points towards this narrative about Trump as Messiah. It's kind of the theological superstructure of this propaganda narrative. Okay, I'm going to wrap up in just a minute. So just want to reflect quickly on what can we do about this. Well, when we think about liberal democracies, which I would argue is what we aspire to, what I aspire to. I aspire to see a world filled with liberal democracies where people have rights and equality, and where everyone has freedom of religion, where everyone has the ability to choose religion or to not choose religion, where everyone has the ability to contribute to society and vote, right? That is what I hope for. Well, the Achilles heel for liberal democracies, our point of greatest weakness is around these authoritarian movements that can come to power using the means of democracy and then overturn the democracy. And authoritarian movements are even more powerful when they get wedded to these religious nationalist movements because they take on the gravitas of religion and can use religion to claim that that is their real mandate. The nature of our world is that it's global and interconnected. And so Christian supremacist messages and ideas migrate through these transnational networks and begin to imperil other democracies as well. Right? The Charlie Kirk, who did not deserve to die, right? I am in no way in favor of political violence. I think it's a horrible thing. But the impact of his death has been to further accelerate the dismantling of global democracies. And we're only beginning to see the edges of that, right? I think as Christians, we can resist the siren song of Christian supremacy. And it is a siren song. It's very appealing to many, many people, this message of Christian empowerment. But doing that, resisting that in our churches requires leadership, it requires good theology, and it requires a willingness to challenge our fellow Christians who are embracing these ideas, to have debates, to have arguments with our fellow Christians about this. And I think we also need to be thinking in a transnational way, even as the right is, because that's just the nature of our world now, right? The world is globalized. The communications technology, the political trends, they don't stay within national borders. And so we can build our own transnational networks and big tent coalitions with people from other religions and people from no religion, but other people who care about democracy and equality and rights. And I think that's the stage that we're at now, is building these bigger coalitions that can use the tools of democracy to challenge these authoritarian movements that are very much on the rise. All right, I'm going to stop speaking and open it up for questions.